Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to you all. Welcome to all those joining us tonight online, and lovely to see you all here physically as well in the room for this EU40 event that zooms in, of course, on extraterritorial sanctions, the impact they're having on the EU, the economic interests of the European Union, and of course the sovereignty of the EU and the EU member states. My name is Méabh McMahon. I'm a reporter with Euronews here in Brussels, and I'm delighted to be here and to see you all here, and of course you physically as well in the room. I'm sure you all have plenty of questions. This is a really interesting topic, so we'll leave plenty of space for that. And there'll also be time for a little networking drink afterwards for those of you that are in the room with us. But first, let me introduce our panel, starting with our host tonight, Marie-Pierre Vedrenne, French lawyer and MEP from Renew Europe, and the Vice Chair of the Committee on International Trade and the Rapporteur, in fact, of the Blocking Statute. Thank you, and lovely to see you here tonight. Beside you is the MEP Lukas Mandl. He's from Austria. He is representing the European People's Party and he's an EU40 board member. Good evening. I can't believe it, but it's true. There you go. We're also joined by Gabriel Orazi. He's a policy officer who works with Alina Nedia, who couldn't be with us tonight. She's the head of unit for DG FISMA, working, of course, on sanctions for the European Commission. So Gabriel kindly stepped in tonight. She's, of course, a very busy woman, as are you, Gabriel, because you, along with Alina, have been working on EU sanctions from their shaping to their negotiation to their implementation and, of course, as well to their enforcement by EU member states. And I know yourself, along with Alina, you've been leading the EU's resilience as well to extraterritorial sanctions on third countries, like the US measures against Iran, against Cuba, and, of course, China's recent action as well. So great to see you, Gabriel. Thank you so much for being with us. And right here beside me is Frédéric Pierucci. He is the former senior manager for Alstom and the author of the book, The American Trap. Has anyone here in the room read the book, The American Trap? Yeah? If not, I'm sure you will all want to read it tonight because it was actually adapted as well into a podcast by France Inter, a very popular podcast, and it won an award. I mean, you can tell us the story a bit later, but it's about you being accused of corruption and being held as an economic hostage. So there you go. That is your weekend read. And the reason you're here with us is because of that, and also because now you work as a consultant, helping companies who are in these predicaments. So we're really excited to hear from you too. Frédéric, thank you so much for joining us. You came from Paris to be with us. And we're gathered, of course, because the European Parliament recently came out with their opinion on extraterritorial sanctions and their impact on trade and investment. And also, it's quite timely that we're all here this week having this discussion with the current events in Ukraine and the sanctions, with the EU already having imposed 4 packages of sanctions against Russia, and the fact that Joe Biden as well, the US president, is coming to town tomorrow. So it's a very timely event. So on that note, I shall pass the floor over to Marie-Pierre Vedrenne, our member of the European Parliament from Renew Europe.
Thank you, Méabh, and good evening, and thank you to be present. It's okay? Microphone? No? Yeah? Okay, perfect. I would like to thank EU40 for, especially Alexandro, for organizing the event, and I'm very happy to share my view of this crucial topic. Like you mentioned, we have also a difficult agenda on this issue. So first, to begin, I would like to draw a big picture of the current situation. Of course, the fact is well known and clear, especially for this panel. Of course, we have also American accidental, but I don't be focused on this issue and to be focused on economic aspects, especially immediate extraterritorial effect for our company. Which respect international law. And I think it's always very important to say that our company respects international law. So we should be saying everywhere that the European Union has the blocking statute, even if it takes mechanism to respond to such a situation. However, the reality is that they are completely ineffective in response to the real issue. Our company, for example, Airbus, Alstom, BNP Paribas, to name few, are still facing unacceptable difficulties. And is it true that, like you say, Méabh, that the new administration, American administration, represents an opportunity? So, of course, it's important take this opportunity. But let's not be naive. The extraterritorial effect with US sanctions that's back like before the Trump administration. And of course, it's very good news that we have Joe Biden in the White House, but maybe on this issue, it don't change anything. So I would like to make a distinction fundamental to better understand how we see also the articulation of the blocking statute review and the upcoming anti-coercion instrument. The United States takes advantage of its legislation to deviate it from its main goal and impose on everyone, European include, their goal. So this is a double objective, put pressure on companies to force them to leave a market, but also to make public authorities, such as the EU and member states, to adopt similar sanctions. So there is two different levels of coercion and two different objectives. So now, of course, for the EU, it's time to move forward because it's also a question of credibility for the EU, but also a question of sovereignty. So we need a reform of the blocking statute to make it effective and efficient for our company. So the Commission has launched a public consultation. So the review of the blocking statute is clearly included of the program of the Commission in 2022. So this is another proof that the European Commission has finally understood the need for strengthened our toolbox and to mold our trade policy. So our main and only objective must be to make the EU blocking statute a concrete and effective tool for our company, and I repeat again, who are compliant with international law. But I think that the first weakness of the EU current blocking statute is the no enforcement. It was originally conceived as a political measure. It was intended to provide to the US administration with a political justification for easing waiver for extraterritorial sanctions toward Europe because of Cuba, Libya, or Iran. And the trait of application of the EU blocking statute was followed by years of non-application. So this stance provides as a paper tiger even by EU company. So we need to address this issue. Second weakness of the current blocking statute, legally speaking, the current regulation can only restrict the EU own economy. This is currently a lack of auxiliary and protective measure in the event that compliance with the blocking statute trigger concrete foreign sanction action, a complying EU company. Third weakness is the difficulty of the procedure for the company also, especially for some company who don't have efficient human resources. So of course, it's also a crucial issue because we need to simplify the implementation of the measure. It's very important. My third and last point, extraterritoriality is economic coercion, not only for our company. And the EU blocking statute alone can only address a part of the problem. So indeed, when the United States adopts sanctions against Iran, with the well-known extraterritorial effect, the objective was to push the EU to adopt similar sanctions. And this is a clearly interstate dispute using economic coercion as a weapon. And in addition, other trading partners follow the same terms. Clear example is, of course, China, especially with Lithuania. And of course, this is unacceptable situation because they use economic, commercial, and political pressure against EU member states who made a sovereign choice to support Taiwan. So now we are in an impasse without any means of action. And of course, we have also the COVID crisis context. We have also the war in Ukraine. So it's very important that EU move forward, and it's why the new instrument of anti-coercion is very, very important. And I think that the proposal based by the Commission is good, because the definition of economic coercion is good, excellent base to have an effective and dissuasive and deterrent instrument. So it's very important to move in this direction, not to have no more excellent definition. And also it's very important to have in the field of the countermeasure a large sector from goods to public procurement, but also to services and intellectual property rights, because it's a large part of our economy. So I think that the proposal made by the Commission is very good. And it's also a trade tool, so it's also very important. So now it's very important to give the power to the Commission to really move forward on this issue, because like I said, it's about our credibility, and it's also about our sovereignty. So to conclude, this terrible war in Ukraine reminds us the necessity to be strong. And today, the European Union, of course, means peace, also stability. And in the context of destabilization for our companies, it's very important that we have all a complete toolbox. And of course, the reform of the blocking statute, but also anti-coercion and other tool. For example, we have an agreement on IPI. It's very important to have all this package to really defend our interests. Thank you.
Marie-Pierre, thank you so much for those opening remarks. So that was the view from Marie-Pierre, representing, of course, the Renew Europe. Now, we don't have anyone from representing the EU member states on the panel, because, of course, I'm sure they would have something different to say. They'd be representing their interests. That's when things, of course, always get interesting. But perhaps, Lukas, you'd like to give us your take. I mean, what's your takeaway from this proposal?
Thank you for having me, first of all. And it's true, as you have mentioned in the introductory round, I'm a board member of EU40, and the one or the other might ask why that can happen, because I'm clearly over 40, but the rule was that in the beginning of the mandate you had to be under 40, and this fitted in my case for 12 days. So this is why I could become active in the EU40 network. But anyway, networks are important here, and to collaboratively work together on this parliamentary level is very important, and that's why I thank the organizers that we can discuss that today, even while it's a very specific moment in history, I would say, when we discuss what extraterritorial sanctions. Because just want to draw for a second our attention on the fact that we are, for the first time in history at all, defending us, ourselves, our children, this generation, the generations to come, our values, against a bloody attack with unbloody means and measures. And the unbloody means and measures are sanctions. And this is why this has to be excluded when we discuss the question of sanctions for regular times and in regular life and in regular geopolitical relations, because in this very moment in time, sanctions are, I would say, even not less than the hope of the world to overcome this war and these war crimes and this brutality against civilians. And this is why we have to draw attention on this part, at least of the terminology of sanctions. I'm more active in the field of foreign policy, of security and defense, also of labor market. Home affairs is also part of my committees. And I strongly believe in the European objective of strategic autonomy. This is also something that's clearly a focus of the French presidency, of France generally, among the member states. Since you have mentioned the member states are not represented today, let's say at least not explicitly. But strategic autonomy is not only a defense thing or a military thing, maybe. Strategic autonomy means that we become capable of taking care of ourselves during crisis. In this crisis, in future crisis, in crisis we might not yet know about. And strategic autonomy covers not only security fields, but also the field of technology, of innovation, of education, of involving talents, also girls and women in the technology procedures, in academia, in science. So there are many, many fields that have to be covered in strategic autonomy. And it also means that we take our own decisions. And my general approach is that especially when it comes to foreign policy and to peace and freedom and the values Europe represent, especially rule of law. Everybody should expect rule of law in Europe. By the way, I have the book of Mr. Pierucci since yesterday. I have not yet read it, frankly, but I at least have it on my bookshelf. And I'm very interested into it. Everybody should expect rule of law in Europe, from the inside and from the outside. Each citizens of Europe, no matter in what member state, by the way, this is also an issue, should expect and have guaranteed rule of law. And also everybody who is investing here, who is coming here, who is making business with us, who is trading here, should be guaranteed with rule of law. But there are other values we want to represent on the planet, not going deeper into dignity and freedom and democracy, but also regarding the environment and the Green Deal, as we call it in this term, taking care of climate change and deal with it properly, that also future generations have proper living conditions. And all of this depends on our strategic autonomy. And this is why strategic autonomy seems to be so important to me. And trade and economic relations and business are, in all of these mentioned fields, rather a part of the solution. To collaboratively work together with others on the planet is part of the solution. And the trouble usually come about if we make borders, if we make tariffs, and if we make, let's say, means and measures of trade wars, as it was also literally called in the years before. So this is why I would say, also given the circumstances we live in today with this attack on Ukraine and other parts, hybrid warfare, which we have experienced over years now, given these circumstances, I would in the first place call sanctions what's called in Latin the ultima ratio. So ultima ratio. That's something that's generally not supporting the fields of solutions like trade and like exchange of goods and services and so on. This is my general approach to these questions. And since Madame Vedrenne has already mentioned Iran, this is a positive example when it comes to European unity, which is a lot of times mentioned at the moment in these days, but even under the previous US administration, we were under pressure a lot. The member states were under pressure to withdraw the JCPOA agreement with Iran. But we didn't do it. The 27 member states stood together, not because they supported in any kind the anti-Semitic ideology of Iran or something that's far beyond anything that we could imagine, but we could deal with the nuclear threat by Iran easier in our European view with a JCPOA agreement than without one. And this is why we stood together. And there are other fields where we can, I also want to mention that, closely work together with our strongest ally and most important ally on the planet, which is the United States, and we can be lucky to have them, also in the current situation in Europe. But strategic autonomy in our self-understanding would also mean that we stand together and remain united and take our own decisions when we come to a different approach. And for example, in terms of Iran, the different approach was to remain with the JCPOA and or even to negotiate a new one. but not to withdraw it and to leave, let's say, this Iranian nuclear threat to whatever, or not to criticize the Iranian state's ideology, which is clearly harmful. But to deal with it with a treaty, with a JCPOA, and this is one of the positive examples, and we should create day by day more of those examples of European self-understanding and strategic autonomy.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there, Lukas. Thank you for that. And bring in the perspective from Business Europe, because we have with us tonight Luisa Santos, the Deputy Director General from Business Europe, also a lawyer by trade. So we're really curious to hear her perspective now. I'm sure it's a busy couple of weeks as well for you, but just as Lukas mentioned, Iran, I mean, tell us how European companies have been impacted by extraterritorial sanctions. I mean, I was reading that the European Council of Foreign Relations show that the reimposition of the US sanctions against Iran cost the EU more than 80 billion euros in losses. I'm sure these are the kind of figures that are floating around your desk on a daily basis. What more can you tell us?
Thank you very much, and well, good evening to all. And it's a very welcome debate, actually, that we're having tonight. And this is a very long-standing issue, the question of extraterritoriality of U.S. sanctions. It's a fact that their sanctions are extraterritorial, but the impact is actually increased by the fact that the dollar is still a hard currency that is used all over the world. And I'm saying this because, of course, many are attempting, and the EU as well, to decrease this exposure to the dollar, to reduce the number of contracts that are done in dollars and possibly replace them by euros. I mean, the Commission did a communication in this direction. Why can we not come and start, trading our energy and raw materials using euros? Why not the big contracts, for instance, in defense, aerospace, why they are not done in euros? Of course, it's not just this. I mean, it's the whole architecture around reinforcing the role of the euro and the monetary union that is at stake. The more we do in this direction, the more the euro will become a stronger currency and a currency used in international transactions. This is very important. It's not just a question of other tools, but I wanted to point out to this aspect of the importance of the dollar. And of course, many are looking at this to reduce their exposure to the extraterritorial impact of US sanctions. We know China is looking to use more and more the yuan, and Russia was already trying to also use more rubles in their big contracts. And the other aspect that we are all seeing, and we saw that Christine Lagarde actually mentioned this, is the use of cryptocurrency. Because, of course, in the current context where you have a lot of financial sanctions that were imposed on Russia, the tendency to use cryptocurrencies will increase. So this is an issue for European companies, and it is an issue for two main reasons. And I think Marie-Pierre already alluded to them. First, because, of course, we have no problem if we agree with the US. So if we are well coordinated, like we have been in the case of Russia now, there is no issue, because we agree. We have a set of sanctions that are equal. They are coordinated also in implementation, because this is very important. It's not only the way they are drafted, the scope of the sanctions, but also how they are implemented. And this is extremely important. It's one of the key messages that we've always been passing since the beginning. When we will start discussing sanctions on Russia, they need to be coordinated, targeted, clear, and they also need to be implemented jointly with, in particular, the US. So this is very important for companies. Of course, and I think we all know that we have seen lately an increase in trade fictions. We have seen an increase in unilateralism. This is not new, but it's a trend that is happening in the last years. And of course, the last US administration gave us a lot of examples on unilateral actions that have consequences on a number of trading partners, including the EU. So one important aspect that I want to bring is that we are seeing some governments using sanctions not for political reasons, because I think Lukas mentioned before, this should be a last resort measure. It should not be a first resort measure. And it should be used only if it is a serious situation, like we are seeing now in the case of Ukraine. We have a war, and it's of course legitimate and expectable that we use sanctions. But in other cases, the sanctions are being used to pursue economic policy objectives. So we are not talking about wars. We are not talking about serious cases. We are talking about ways of pursuing the economic interests of a country at the expense of others. And this is where the problems start. So we are concerned about this. We are concerned about the more and more extensive use of sanctions and the fact that we cannot control them and we are impacted by them. So how can we protect ourselves from these unwanted sanctions, those that are not coordinated, those that are not exceptional, but have very detrimental impacts on our companies? Of course, we have the blocking status. This is clearly an instrument that exists, but it doesn't work. I mean, Gabriel knows this very well because we've been talking for this for many years. It doesn't work. And it doesn't work because it does not protect the European companies from the extraterritorial impact. It actually puts the European companies in a very difficult situation. If we don't comply, what happens? If we are taken to a court in the US, if we are obliged to, if we don't go there, and in the end we have a decision against the European company, what happens? We will still be liable. We will still need to compensate. So this is a serious issue. So we expect the blocking status to protect better European companies in these cases. Then we need to use other tools as well. And Marie-Pierre, you mentioned them already. The anti-coercion tool instrument could be indeed a tool to use in certain cases. I mean, we know the case of China and Lithuania is a clear case where we see a government using economic coercion to put pressure in a given government. So does this kind of procedures, this kind of action, is this going to be tackled by, not by maybe the blocking status, but then we need to have other instruments to do it. So we need actually to have a combination of instruments to try to protect better and defend better the European economic interests. But ultimately, I think what I liked very much what Lukas said. I mean, in the end, what we want is to have better cooperation and trade. So even if we have a problem, and I'm not talking about Ukraine because this is a real serious situation where, of course, we need to act differently. But for normal cases, I think the ideal solution is always to try to find a compromise, to try to use existing multilateral forum, including the WTO. And then if these don't work, then we definitely need to use other tools. And in this, we totally agree that the EU is trying right now to adopt a number of instruments, the international procurement instrument, the anti-coercion instrument. All these go in the direction of trying to protect more our interests. But I have to say we need to work on the other side as well. We need to continue to show to our partners that we are ready to engage in a more positive agenda, including opening up our markets. We need to continue to do trade agreements. This is very important because otherwise what we will see is an increase in multilateralism, an increase in frictions, and this will not be good, neither for the economic, neither for the peace and stability in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much there. The perspective from Business Europe, from Luisa Santos, the Deputy Director General. I think it makes sense now just to move right over to Gabriel, who you both obviously know each other very well, to hear his perspective on what we heard there from Luisa Santos, which is quite frankly the blocking statute does not work. What would you say to that? I mean, it's clearly the news as well and current affairs are moving faster than the Commission.
Thank you very much, Méabh, and everyone on the panel. I'm very happy to be here. As you can see, I'm not Alina. Alina is my head of unit. She could not make it today, so I will try to fill in her shoes. I am bringing the perspective of the European Commission, although, of course, I'm talking as a private person and nothing should be attributed to the European Commission. Maybe just also to say forward on what the role of the Commission is in the universe, let's say, of sanctions and extraterritoriality. And that role is for sanctions, it's of course to coordinate the proposals of sanctions with the External Action Service and the High Representative. But let's keep in mind those are decided ultimately by the Council by unanimity. So a lot of questions will come up, and I hear they coming about why this person or that person was not sanctioned. That unfortunately it's not for the Commission. But what the Commission actually does is to help with the implementations of the sanctions. So when you have the legal text, these are the people that are writing actually the guidelines, the implementing measures, and all those that are documents that are helpful for businesses and people to actually put those into effect. And the second, let's say, hat that we have today is also the one on extraterritoriality. This is a very close topic, and the topic of extraterritoriality in particular is about the economic and financial system, and we as a unit in particular are responsible for the application of this blocking statute. So let me get back to the topic of today. I also would like to start by saying, you all know that the EU moves forward, they say, every time that there's a crisis. So we cannot talk about the current crisis of Ukraine and Russia's aggression on this particular negative events that happened last month. As you have seen, the response of the EU has been strong and prompt. And especially what I think it's really important to stress was the coordination that we had, in particular with allies, the United States, the UK, and other G7 partners. And as I think Luisa was saying, it's important to understand that this coordination does not only happen at the moment where we impose and decide the sanctions, but also when it comes to implementation. So there is a lot happening behind the scenes so that there is a lot of coordination and that we don't step on each other's toes. So I think the question for tonight is, given that there is such a big alignment with allies all around the world, do we still need to talk about extraterritoriality at all? Is this really a relevant topic anymore? So my personal opinion is that, yes, the topic is even more relevant today than it was before. And this is mainly for, let's say, two reasons, or at least let's take a look west, and then let's take a look east. If we take a look westward, of course, the cooperation with the United States is great, and as Honorable Mandl said, it's important that we have the United States as one of our closest allies. And I don't want to put into question the transatlantic alliance, but it is also true that the United States and Europe have different geopolitical interests. And sometimes there are areas where the sanctions, the policies do not align. So this is normal, and we should be ready in such a situation. I also would like to remind everyone that the elections in the United States are happening very soon in November, so it's possible that there will be a little change, at least in the administration. Not of the presidency, but Congress could, of course, as they say, flip. What we said that is the most important topic and instrument to resolve issues about extraterritoriality is dialogue. And that's what we are doing right now, for example, in devising the Russia sanctions. But we should be ready in case there is a little bit of disagreement. If we look eastward, this is what I think the blocking statute was a little bit blind in its first drafting. As you know, the blocking statute is only focused on the United States measures because probably those are the most famous ones, as Mr. Pierucci will tell us. I think we have to also look about East, and especially China and Russia. And the recent aggression of Russia has shown that, for example, China has been very hesitating and has also been interested in challenging, let's say, the world order as it is right now. we have seen, for example, I think someone already mentioned those anti-sanctions law by China last year, actually resulting, if I'm not wrong, in sanctions against certain congresspersons in the US. We also have seen, of course, Russia counteracting and trying to counter our sanctions with counter-sanctions. And we have seen, for example, travel bans on US President Biden. So I think, in my view, at least, it's important to move forward. So what is the EU doing about it? I think there have been a number of strategies that have been announced post-COVID as a new world order about fostering the European, what they call open strategic autonomy. So it's a very difficult concept, I agree, and I think what has to be kept in mind is the two words. The first is autonomy, so the ability for the EU at least to try to set it on its own course at global level. But the second adjective, which is really important, is open. So the idea is not to close navel-gazing, it's really to maintain this openness that has been challenged by this unilateralism. So there have been a number of strategies to tackle this new world order. They have covered, for example, the new trade strategy, of which the anti-coercion instrument is part, industry strategy, but also as the Commission in particular, we were involved in this, is the new strategy that we published in January last year about strengthening, in a way, the EU economic and financial systems. And I think Luisa mentioned this, one of these strategies, one of these pillars in these strategies to reinforce the role of the international role of the euro. The second is also to take a look at our financial infrastructures so that they are more resilient to these type of measures, extraterritorial measures. And finally, a stronger policy on sanctions and, of course, the review of the blocking statute. So why do we need a new blocking statute? I think Honorable Vedrenne and also Luisa Santos has repeated multiple times. We have heard it from companies. We have had public consultations during September, October, November. We've heard all stakeholders, and they told us we are kept between a rock and a hard place. The blocking statute, it's not easy to implement. So I think it's true, the problem has evolved. So the blocking statute was very helpful and has been very helpful in the 25 years of its existence. But of course, the world has changed, and especially as we have seen with the example of Iran, we need a new blocking statute. First of all, because there have been a magnitude of new sanctions, especially, as we said, during the Trump administration, so coming from the United States, of course. But also, as we're saying, the world has changed, and the blocking statute should also look a little bit more east. And second, also, the world has changed. I think in 1996, this is the year of the original blocking statute, of course, globalization existed, but supply chains, value chains were not as integrated as they are today. And today, certain countries, of course, that have they can put their finger on certain nodes and certain hubs, then they can, of course, control or at least have an influence on other countries. So what we are trying to do with the review of the blocking statute is, of course, first of all, to reduce the vulnerability of the EU in general and of our companies. And so to have this sort of more protective element, which was one of the main, actually, topics that came out during the stakeholder consultations. And, of course, to try to switch, in a way, the cost for this extraterritoriality, not only on our companies, our operators, but also on the countries that are imposing those sanctions. The second one is, I think, a drawback and a shortcoming that was, again, mentioned by Honorable Vedrenne, is the issue of compliance. So what we would like to do is to make it easier, first of all, for companies to comply, because in the end, what we want is to have more compliance, which in the end will lead to less vulnerability. And also, of course, of member states, because in the end, the authorities of member states are the one responsible for the implementation of the sanctions. So also to say, maybe as a concluding word, that there are other initiatives that have been put forward. I work on the blocking statute, and I believe it's an amazing instrument, but let's be real, it is not the silver bullet to every problem in the world. So it's important that you see this as a piece of the puzzle. And the other pieces of the puzzle are probably some of the initiatives that have been mentioned today. One is the anti-coercion instrument. Other ones could be the IPI, so the International Procurement Instrument, and many other instruments that will be put in place by the EU in the future. But as maybe word of conclusion, let's use actually this crisis to move forward, and let's not actually stop ourselves. We should think, I think, in the long run. So there are priorities, of course, at the moment, but the world is changing, and it's important that we keep focused on what we want. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much there, Gabriel, doing a great job stepping in for your boss. Thank you so much for that, and describing the blocking statute as an amazing instrument, but not the silver bullet. So there you go. That's the view from the Commission. And now waiting patiently here is Frédéric Pierucci, who I would like to hear from now. First, perhaps a little bit about the book and how it led you to do what you do now, which is help companies out in these predicaments, and also your reaction to, of course, what you've heard so far. And while he's speaking, you can be preparing your questions that you might have for our experts.
Thank you so much. So, very glad to be here today. I'm going to broaden a little bit the discussion, because we talked a lot about sanctions, but sanctions is only one part of the problem. The problem is basically the lawfare and the use of the law as an economic weapon to destabilize companies, and especially European companies. The US has got a big panel of laws that they apply in an extraterritorial way. They have, of course, sanctions, but they have also export control laws. They have the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act. They have the INTA rules. They have the Cloud Act to define what goes on with your data stored in the cloud. They have the FISMA Act, and so on. So the US is using this big panel of laws every year, and every year you have a new law coming up. So if we address only the sanction issue, we are addressing a very small part of the bigger problem. The problem with all this is really the fact that those laws are, first of all, bipartisan. So to think that Biden is going to change anything to what Trump has done, in fact, it's a pure vision of theory, because in practice, the people and the government who has been using the law as an extraterritorial way, the president who has really made it in an industrial way is under Obama statute. Between the 8 years under President Obama, you see a large number of European companies sanctioned by the EU for infringement of the US laws. I will give you one example, which is the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act. The Foreign Corrupt Practice Act was enacted in 1977. It became extraterritorial in 1998, and between 1977 and 1998, they didn't really go after their companies. After it became extraterritorial, they started to target foreign companies, and if you look at the number of companies which have been prosecuted in the US, you can see that only 25% of the fines are going to American companies, where 75% of the fines are going to mainly European companies. And they started with very different sectors, very strategic sector, oil and gas sector, telecom sector, energy sector, and they went across Europe. So oil and gas sectors, they went after Total in France, Eni in Italy, Statoil in Norway. You can take the telecom sector, they went after Alcatel, they went after Ericsson, they went after Telia in Sweden. You can take the power generation sector, they went after Siemens in Germany, ABB in Sweden, Alstom in France, and so on. What you can see here is the shocking thing is the way they treat this law, because there is a huge asymmetry of the way they treat foreign companies versus American companies. I'll give you an example. In the power generation sector, you saw all the major competitors of US companies, so Siemens, Alstom, ABB, Hitachi in Japan, targeted by the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act. So it means in the last 15 years, I found a lot of cases of those companies bribing people overseas. In the last 50 years since the law exists in the US, no US company has ever been targeted for infringement of the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act. So General Electric, Westinghouse, Bechtel, you can name all of the US companies never targeted. You can take the aeronautical sector. You can see that Airbus has been targeted, Embraer in Brazil, and you can see that Boeing in 50 years have never paid any bribe anywhere, and they have never been prosecuted in the US for paying any bribe. You take the oil and gas sector, it's exactly the same thing. So the consequence for European company is very important, because when a company is targeted like this, usually it's weakened in the very long run, and you can see very often that those companies are later bought by American company. For instance, in the French case of Alstom, Alstom was taken over by General Electric just after paying the big sanction and the big fine, which meant for France that we lost part of our sovereignty on the power generation equipment, because 75% of the electricity in France is produced by nuclear power plants, as you probably know, and Alstom was doing the maintenance for all the turbines for all the industrial park of nuclear park of EDF. So when Alstom was sold to General Electric, just after the sale to General Electric threatened EDF to stop providing spare parts for the nuclear power plants in France. So basically threatened to put the country in the dark if they were not renegotiating the contract. So you give a lot of power to a foreign company on strategic issues. I gave you the example in the telecom sector with, you know, there's been a big war on the 5G. The US Department of Justice went after Ericsson. They made Ericsson pay a huge fine of $1 billion, which weakened, obviously, the company. And one person said, just after having put a $1 billion fine to Ericsson, that in the interest of the US, in order to control the 5G, US investors should buy Nokia and or Ericsson. And the person who said that is William Barr, the head of the Department of Justice. So you see the direct link between the US Department of Justice and the economic interest of the US. So having said that, you know, how did we protect ourselves in Europe in the last 20 years? Well, extremely poorly. We didn't protect our companies, you know, because all those companies have paid huge fine to the US government. All those companies have been destabilized. As you rightly said, the blocking statute did not help at all those companies, because it's between a rock and a hard place. Because when you are under investigation by the US Department of Justice, they ask you to cooperate with the US Department of Justice. And cooperate with the US Department of Justice, it means that you have to give them everything that they want. You have to give them all the data from your company, from your clients. You have to give all your financial transactions. You have to give all the email exchanged by all your employees over the last 5 years or 10 years, depending on the statute of limitation or not. They even go ask companies to renounce to statute of limitation to show good cooperation with the US Department of Justice. And all companies renounce to statute of limitation, which is usually 5 years on this. That's why they're able to go back 5 years, 10 years in the case of Alstom, 10 years in the case of Total, 18 years back. So you cannot ask European companies to follow the blocking statute, because they have a huge interest to cooperate with the US Department of Justice, because by cooperating with the Department of Justice, they can expect to lower their fines by half, for instance, and half means potentially hundreds of millions of dollars benefit on the other side of the pond. Whereas on this side, okay, I'm going to infringe the blocking statute, but anyway, nobody's going to give me any fine, and if they give me a fine, it's a double penalty anyway. So it's not going to protect European companies to do that. That's why we have been very, very weak going in the last few years. So now we are stepping up to another level, because as you probably know, after the Snowden story and the WikiLeaks story, a lot of companies in the US worked with the NSA to basically spy on European citizens, spy on European companies, steal information on European companies. I remind you that there's a NSA order which says that all the companies in Europe negotiating contracts above 200 million should be targeted. So it means all the managers of those companies have their emails, their telephone conversation typed by the NSA with the help of more than 100 US telecom companies. Did you see any reaction in Europe following this? Did you see any of the GAFA and the other companies who worked for the NSA who have infringed a lot of European laws, espionage laws, data protection laws, and so on. Did you see any of those companies being prosecuted in Europe for having breached our own laws? Zero. So we didn't react at all. So what they did in the US, they gave, of course, immunity to those companies on the US side. Fine. But on the European side, they did not have any immunity, those companies, to spy on us and on our companies. So in order to protect their company going forward after the Snowden revelation, they published the Cloud Act. What does it say, the Cloud Act? It says if you store your data in the cloud, and if the company is under investigation by the US Department of Justice or others, the service provider, if it's a US company, they have the obligation to transfer your data to the US without even telling you. So by doing this, they replace the multilateral agreement between Ministry of Justice in the US and Ministry of Justice in Europe, which is the usual channel to transfer information if you are prosecuted by a foreign country, by addressing this request directly to the GAFA and the others. So they are completely outside of any international treaty and so on. So my generation was not able to do anything about it. Your generation, hopefully, will do something about it because we need really to protect European interests, and I really hope that this is going to be addressed in a much stronger way. Thank you.
And thank you so much for that very interesting intervention there, Frédéric. I'm sure you have a lot more to say, but of course the clock is ticking. And if there's anyone in the audience who would like to pose a question, you can start raising your hand and I shall come to you. In the meantime, I would like to ask you, Marie-Pierre, what do you think the message then should be this week to President Biden? I mean, Roberto Metsola will be there in the room for a short period, because I don't understand why, for example, this blocking statute was not mentioned in the Trade and Technology Council meeting a couple of weeks ago. I mean, obviously it's a sensitive issue, but these are the issues you have to talk about, especially in this kind of format, right?
Thank you for all this explanation. I think that we see with all the testimony that the European Union needs really to build our strategic autonomy and to have a reality of this concept. It's not a concept. It's very important for our enterprise, so also for our work in Europe. So it's time now to not have only slogans and to act like you push all the new generation to act. Like you said, Marie-Pierre, of course, TTC was focused on the situation and all the different aspects of TTC. But we discussed yesterday with Margaret Vestager and Valdis Dombrovskis in International Trade Committee. And like Luisa said, of course, it's important to have a positive agenda with US. But it's also very important to make on the table what doesn't work. And like you said also, we have some negative issue with US. And of course, it's very important to have cooperation and to have a dialogue between US and EU. But sometimes, if we want to be credible, it's also very important to be united, of course, and to make on the table all our trouble with US. Because I think that with this issue, with the extraterritorial effect, we have a question of our credibility and to act like a geopolitical actor. It was at the beginning of the mandate, Ursula von der Leyen says that now she wants a geopolitical commission. It's very important to act like that. Yeah. So it's why I think that all the parliament push also the commission, but also member states. And I think that sometimes, and also my states, it's very important to have also the engagement, commitment from also member states on this issue. So It's very important to have a unite message also on this issue.
Okay. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to address a question to our panelists? Yeah? If you would just like to tell us your name, perhaps, and who you're representing, that would be lovely. I think you're fine. Well, just for our guests online, perhaps, it would be great. Do we have a microphone? One sec. Here.
Thank you. My name is Robbie Schreiber. I've gained more than 25 years experience in public affairs work with the European Union, the various institutions. Before I come to the real question, a little remark to what Ms. Vedrenne said. You don't have to push the European Commission. The Council, that means the Member States, and the European Parliament just has to take decisions and the Commission will implement them. That's my experience. Second thing, I've heard a long list of problems that we are facing with extraterritorial sanctions. But I haven't heard any specific, concrete, precise example of what you have as ideas in your mind. What kind of specific actions could be taken? Point A, against the United States as counteractions, and point B, against all kind of other target countries. Maybe you can enlighten us a little bit on that. Thank you.
That's a great question. Thank you so much for it. Are there any other questions? Yeah, we've one here.
Should I also
Grab the mic, yeah, that would be great.
Thank you. Yeah, so building on this discussion, I wanted to ask on the TTC.
Can you just tell us your name? Thank you so much.
So my name is Carlos, and I work in EU policy consulting in the field of international trade. So yeah, building on the discussion on the TTC, wouldn't you think that it would be smart, let's say, to build a new working group within the TTC for dealing with issues related to extraterritorial sanctions or other trade restrictive measures? Because, I mean, the working groups of the TTC are not set in stone, and to set it in a certain way. Second thing, so many companies, as he had just remarked, many EU companies are facing issues of extraterritorial sanctions. For example, let's say in Cuba, who are operating on expropriating land in Cuba. What measures are being taken right now to help these companies? Because all these trade defense measures, instruments that the EU will adopt, the foreign subsidies regulation, IPI, anti-coercion instrument, etc., are not yet in place. So what measures are being taken right now to help, let's say, the Spanish hotel companies operating in Cuba?
Carlos, thank you so much for those two questions. One on the possibility of a working group being set up, the other on helping companies in Cuba, and also the question there on what countermeasures can be put on the table, what solutions can our panel provide tonight. Who would like to go first tackling those questions? We'll start with Luis Santos.
Thanks. There's one point I didn't mention, but I think it's important to mention as well. The US uses these instruments for many years, so these sanctions and other legislation for many, many years. And it is capable of discriminating positively its companies. So we have not talked about waivers, because the US can and does give a lot of waivers to its companies. So what we saw in the case of Iran, for instance, is that even if the US was very tough, and it was the toughest of all, and introducing sanctions, in the end, we still had some US companies doing business in Iran while European companies were not able to do it. So this is how the instruments are being used. So they are being used in a way, as I was saying in my initial intervention, not sanctions not as a last resort, but as a way of gaining economic advantages and of positively discriminating in favor of US companies. So this is how it is, and I think Frédéric also mentioned this. So it is not easy, of course, to address this. And it's not easy to find one solution. As I said, we need to work in different instruments, and I think this is what we are doing. One is definitely to make sure that we use more the euro, because we are extremely exposed to the dollar. And what is happening as well is that because we are so much exposed, our financial institutions are extremely exposed to the extraterritorial impact of US sanctions. It means that in many cases, our banks even overcomply because they are afraid of being fined. I mean, one of the biggest fines was on one European bank, BNP Paribas. So it's very clear that there is a strong concern from the banking sector that whatever they do, they even overcomply if needed be, just to avoid having to face these sanctions. So we definitely need to work here. We need to use other instruments like the anti-coercion for certain practices. For the US, of course, we will need to revise the blocking status regulation. We need, the idea of the blocking status is to provide the possibility of European companies not complying with US sanctions. It's not easy, because of course, if you are exposed to the US market, it's going to be very difficult for you to go against the US administration, because then your business in the US is ruined. But not only that, it's because you are trading with dollars in many of your operations, even if you're not operating in the US. So you have the US dollar nexus. So you could even be targeted if you're not operating in the US. So it's very complex. And we hope that the blocking status can at least cushion a little bit the impact on European companies. I mean, there is one atomic weapon, of course, is that if we start doing the same. But this is something that, for the moment, we are not able, and I have to say also as Business Europe, to say let's start to also be extraterritorial. Let's start also to do the same as the US. Maybe this will not happen immediately, but maybe this will be something that we could foresee. But if we go in this direction, of course, this will become the norm, because then it's going to be us, it's going to be China, it's going to be other important players that are actually also having, as Gabriel already mentioned, they also have blocking status legislation. The China has the anti-foreign sanctions law, because everyone is facing the same problem. Nobody knows how to deal with this attitude of the US. So it's not easy. It's not easy, and we need to use different tools, and even that, the only way is if we start doing the same. Will this deter the US? Are we able to do the same? And will this resolve the problem? I still have my doubts, frankly, but it's a discussion maybe we can open up once we have the new proposal from the Commission on the revised blocking status. And this will also address the question of Cuba, by the way, because, I mean, the whole question of Cuba is precisely regarding this, is the fact that we had a suspension of the cases of the Helms-Burton, but then in the meantime, the suspension was unfrozen, so you start having procedures in the US against European companies on the basis of the Helms-Burton. And the only way to protect them is through the blocking status that actually is not working, because, of course, they are being taken to court in the US if they don't comply. So it's complicated, yeah.
Okay, Luisa Santos, thank you so much for that. It is just 7 minutes past 7, so we have another 4 minutes. If our panellists would all like to tackle the questions and give a little bit of a wrap up in about 2 minutes. Frédéric, I'd like to start with you, and if you could address the question of Carlos there about the possibility of the working group.
Thank you so much. I just want to remind everybody that about 30 years ago, we had the same problem with the US on competition law. The US started to target European companies because they were doing cartels, and they started to put a lot of fines to European companies. At that time, we were able to react. We did exactly the same thing. We started to put big fines to US companies for the same thing. And then, at the end of the day, they went back home. Now they are treating their own cases. We are treating our own cases in Europe on cartels issue. 30 years later, we are unable to do the same thing. The problem now is that we are going to have multilateral jurisdictions. Is that, as you rightly say, you have the US who are having their extraterritorial laws. You have the Chinese who are, they don't have an extraterritorial law, but basically they are starting to have counter sanctions. Europe is doing to counter sanctions. So now, a company which signs the contracts, he will have a multitude of laws that will apply to a single contract, and some of those laws will contradict each other. So companies will have to infringe a law in order to be able to do business. And we cannot have this kind of insecure environment for our companies. So we need to find a way to reestablish this. And I'm agreeing with you that unfortunately, this is a country that only knows force. And if you don't go back with the same kind of weapon against their companies, it's going to be complicated. I think the solution is not to put more burden on our companies with blocking statute law and this kind of thing. Because they're just going to laugh at us. They're just going to go, in order to protect their companies, they put more burden on their own companies to do that. It's not good. It's not going to be the way to go forward. Thank you.
So Gabriel, if you'd like to come in there for your little 2-minute wrap up.
Thank you very much. Very interesting questions from the audience and also from the panelists. I just also wanted to wrap up to also remind everyone about this problem about extraterritoriality it does not only touch is about like international trade or everything. I think it's an important question to have, because it also touches our internal market, our single market. And just to give you an example, because I always give you this example, don't try it at home, but try to make a transfer to your mom, for example, in Europe, saying this is the money for Cuba. It will be blocked. Even if it's Belgium to Belgium, Belgium to Ireland, euro, not about any Cuban pesos or anything. So this is something that touches us in our everyday life, and that's why it's such an important question to be asked. The second, I really like the questions that said, okay, let's give it a positive spin. What can we do about it? And I think this is what we tried to do the past month, last year, with stakeholders to understand what can we do to help. And it's not easy. As we said, the blocking statute is only one piece of the solution. If we take, for example, just for change, the actions that China took against Lithuania, there are multiple ways of approaching, for example, with existing and future tools. One, for example, which was the first one that was triggered, is the WTO. So let's not forget, as some of the panelists were saying, that there are international fora. The second could be, of course, the anti-coercion instrument, if and when that amounts to coercion. And then if that is extraterritorial, because there could be extraterritorial effects, especially on other member states who are nothing to do with Lithuania or China, let's use the blocking statute. So the idea is for me to let's continue this path. Please, let's not do the same, because otherwise we'll just go into a complete mess. And it's important that we use all these tools together to actually reach a solution. And what is really, really important, I think, as a concluding word, is that all these tools are not intended to escalate or to have a tit for tat. But the idea is really to have these tools in the back pocket so that you can bring the other country to the table and say, okay, this is not acceptable for us, and we would like to find a solution. So this is my take of today's talks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gabriel. Lukas, 1 minute wrap from you.
Thank you. So it's only 1 minute anymore.
Yeah, your time is being reduced because people are getting hungry.
I'll try the best. Also, thanks from my side, without losing time for that. But it was really inspiring to listen as well to the panel and to the questions. Robbie, this is it, and it's the $1 million question, or let's rather say the €1 million question today, listening to Ms. Santos, regarding the specific actions that have to be taken. And I'm not the one who can answer it entirely, but I can share some thoughts, and we have already heard something. Most importantly, I want to draw the attention on a term we have not heard yet today, and I'm surprised about that. I've even not used myself it before. It's reciprocity. It may sound philosophically, but actually one of the lessons of the current geopolitical situation is, in my view, that maybe sometimes the European approach on cooperation is diplomacy, and diplomacy is sometimes seen as a weakness, obviously, in other parts of the world. So we should not present the other parts of the world with a weakness, which is actually a strength, and we should demand reciprocity with weapons. The word was used for that, and sometimes the weapon we have, we don't use, because we don't have to use, is the best one. Reciprocity is the one thing I want to share. The other thing in this brief time is cooperation, and this is the secret of Europe's success, is cooperation to the inside, and we should keep this approach of cooperation to the rest of the world, also in the respects we've already talked about today. And that means that we have to seek even more cooperation, meaning WTO must run, and we have to get it running, or we need a different structure. I completely agree with Ms. Santos here. I agree with Mr. Gabriel has said on autonomy and openness. So this duality of autonomy and openness seems to be very important in that field, and the Trade and Technology Council. And this is something our friend Carlos has mentioned. This is an opportunity for cooperation. So if we seek for cooperation rather more than for confrontation, as other parts of the world do, the Trade and Technology Council is an opportunity. You know this old joke that if there is something new on the planet, it's a joke, okay? But it's a good joke. If there's something new on the planet, the Americans have invented it, the Chinese are producing it, and what Europe is doing is to regulate it. This would be the old joke, but we live more and more in times where even the Americans, and I've experienced that in November when I was there in Boston and DC with think tanks and universities, academia, they more and more tend to understand that in some respect, more regulation in the digital sphere will be important. And maybe last point, I would really like to have been the famous fly on the wall when Commission President Juncker was talking to the former US president, because he achieved something. I don't know how, but many parts of the so-called trade war were withdrawn then at that time, and maybe this was part of what Mr. Pierucci meant, to use, let's say, the same means and measures, not to be too diplomatic where diplomacy is maybe seen as a weakness. But this has to be implemented structurally. We don't always have a Juncker to talk to a Trump. We need it structurally.
Maybe you'll find out. Maybe he's writing his book as we speak, Jean-Claude Juncker. His memoirs. Thank you so much for that, Lukas. Marie-Pierre, will I just give you the last, or did you want to make a last comment? Okay. So Marie-Pierre, if you'd like to give the last final comment to the floor, and then we'll invite you all for a drink.
Thank you all for your comment. It's difficult to conclude because it's not a conclusion, because now we have to work and to continue to working. Maybe all the time we say that we don't want escalation. And of course, it's also my objective. But since a long time ago, of course, I'm maybe more younger than some people in this room, but since I work on European affairs, all the time we defend rule-based trade, and we need to continue rule-based trade. But if we need to attain this objective, it's very important to have the tool to defend it. And if we don't have all the toolbox, you mentioned reciprocity. We have now an agreement of public procurement on reciprocity. We have to work on anti-coercion. We have to work on foreign subsidy. Of course, like you said, it's not possible to solve all the problem with one instrument. FTA is a part of the solution. Defense autonomous measure is also a part of the solution. It's not because we have all these instruments that we want to use it, but if we want to be able to defend our vision, our interest, our values, our ambition, it's very important to have this instrument. Because if we want to negotiate with other source countries, if we have nothing, what is our credibility? So it's why I think that it's very important to push all the European institutions, of course the Council, of course the Commission. But I remember also that the role of the European Commission is to defend global European interest. Of course, we need to push all the institutions, and it's the role of the European Parliament because we are also elected by citizens. Thank you so much for your invitation and for the organization of this event.
Thank you so much, Marie-Pierre Vedrenne, for that. You're very energised after this to get straight to work. Thank you also to Lukas Mandl for your interventions there, the Austrian MEP from the European People's Party. Thank you so much to Gabriel Orazi for stepping in there from DG FISMA. It was really interesting as well to hear from you. Thanks to Luisa Santos, Deputy Director General from Business Europe, and of course to Frédéric Pierucci. We're all going to read your book really soon, and then hopefully you come back to visit us again in Brussels so we can deep dive into the more details of it. Thank you so much for being with us. And thank you to all of you that were watching online. It was a pleasure to have you with us. And for those in the room, do come for a drink and network now that we finally can after 2 years of wearing masks. And thanks, of course, to EU40 and all the team that put tonight's event together. Take care and see you soon.
Thank you so much.